5. How Bessie Blithesome came to the Laughing Valley. One day, as Claus sat before his door to enjoy the sunshine while he busily carved the head and horns of a toy deer, he looked up and discovered a glittering cavalcade of horsemen approaching through the valley. When they drew nearer, he saw that the band consisted of a score of men-at-arms, clad in bright armor and bearing in their hands spears and battle-axes. In front of these rode little Bessie Blithesome, the pretty daughter of the proud Lord of Lerd, who had once driven Claus from his palace. Her palfrey was pure white. Its bridle was covered with glittering gems, and its saddle draped with cloth of gold richly broidered. The soldiers were sent to protect her from harm while she journeyed. Claus was surprised, but he continued to whittle and sing until the cavalcade drew up before him. Then the little girl leaned over the neck of her palfrey and said, "Please, Mr. Claus, I want a toy." Her voice was so pleading that Claus jumped up at once and stood beside her, but he was puzzled how to answer her request. "You're a rich lord's daughter," said he, "and you have all that you desire." "Except toys," said Bessie. "There are no toys in all the world but yours. And I can make them for the poor children who have nothing else to amuse them," continued Claus. "Do poor children love to play with toys more than rich ones?" asked Bessie. "I suppose not," said Claus thoughtfully. "Am I to blame because my father is a lord? Must I be denied the pretty toys I long for because other children are poorer than I?" she inquired earnestly. "I'm afraid you must, dear," he answered, "for the poor have nothing else with which to amuse themselves. You have your pony to ride, your servants to wait on you, and every comfort that money can procure." "But I want toys," cried Bessie, wiping away the tears that forced themselves into her eyes. "If I cannot have them, I shall be very unhappy." Claus was troubled, for her griefs recalled to him the thought of his desire to make all children happy, without regard to their condition in life. Yet, while so many poor children were clamoring for his toys, he could not bear to give one of them to Bessie Blithesome, who had so much already to make her happy. "Listen, my child," he said gently. "All the toys I am now making are promised to others. But the next shall be yours, since your heart so longs for it. Come to me again in 2 days, and it shall be ready for you." Bessie gave a cry of delight and, leaning over her pony's neck, kissed Claus prettily upon his forehead. Then, calling to her men-at-arms, she rode gaily away, leaving Claus to resume his work. "If I am happy to supply the rich children as well as the poor ones," he thought, "I shall not have a spare moment in the whole year. But is it right that I should give to the rich? Surely I must go to Necile and talk with her about this matter." So, when he had finished the toy deer, which was very like a deer he had known in the forest glades, he walked into Bessie and made his way to the bower of the beautiful nymph Necile, who had been his foster mother. She greeted him tenderly and lovingly, listening with interest to his story of the visit of Bessie Blithesome. "And now tell me," said he, "shall I give toys to rich children?" "We of the forest know nothing of riches," she replied. "It seemed to me that one child is like another child, since they are all made of the same clay, and that riches are like a gown, which may be put on or taken away, leaving the child unchanged. But the fairies are guardians of mankind, and know mortal children better than I. Let us call the fairy queen." This was done, and the queen of the fairies sat beside them and heard Claus relate his reasons for thinking the rich children could get away without his toys, and also what the nymph had said. "Necile is right," declared the queen, "for, whether he is rich or poor, a child's longings for pretty playthings are but natural. Rich Bessie's heart may suffer as much grief as poor Mayrie's. She can be just as lonely and discontented, and just as gay and happy. I think, friend Claus, it is your duty to make all the little ones glad, whether they chance to live in palaces or cottages." "Your words are wise, fair queen," replied Claus, "and my heart tells me that they are just as they are wise. Hereafter all children may claim my services." Then he bowed before the gracious fairy, and, kissing Necile's red lips, went back into his valley. At the brook he stopped to think, and afterward he sat on the bank and took a piece of moist clay in his hands, and while he thought what sort of toy he should make for Bessie Blithesome, he did not notice that his fingers were working the clay into shape, until, glancing downward, he had found that he had unconsciously formed the head that bore a slight resemblance to the nymph Necile. At once he became interested. Gathering more of the clay from the bank, he carried it into the house. Then, with the aid of his knife and a bit of wood, he succeeded in working the clay into the shape of a toy nymph. With skillful strokes he formed long waving hair on the head and covered the body with a gown of oak leaves, while the 2 feet sticking out of the bottom of the gown were clad in sandals. But the clay was soft, and Claus found that he must handle it gently to avoid ruining his pretty work. Perhaps the rays of sun will draw out the moisture and cause the clay to become hard, he thought. So he laid the image on a flat board and placed it in the glare of the sun. This done, he went to his bench and began painting the toy deer, and soon he became so interested in the work that he forgot all about the clay nymph. But the next morning, happening to notice it as it lay on the board, he found that the sun had baked it into the hardness of stone, and it was strong enough to be safely handled. Claus now painted the nymph with great care in the likeness of Necile, giving it deep blue eyes, white teeth, rosy lips, and ruddy brown hair. The gown he colored oak leaf green, and when the paint was dry, Claus himself was charmed with the new toy. Of course, it was not nearly so lovely as the real Necile, but, considering the material of which it was made, Claus thought that it was very beautiful. When Bessie, riding upon her white palfrey, came into his dwelling the next day, Claus presented her with the new toy. The little girl's eyes were brighter than ever as she exclaimed to the pretty image, and she loved it at once, and held it close to her breast as a mother does to her child. "What's it called, Claus?" she asked. Now Claus knew that nymphs do not like to be spoken of by mortals, so he could not tell Bessie that it was an image of Necile he had given her. But it was a new toy. He searched his mind for a new name to call it by, and the first word he thought of he decided would do very well. "It's called a dolly, my dear," he said to Bessie. "I shall call the dolly my baby," returned Bessie, kissing it fondly, "and I shall tend to it and care for it just as the nurse cares for me. Thank you very much, Claus. Your gift has made me happier than I've ever been before." Then she rode away, hugging the toy in her arms, and Claus, seeing her delight, thought that he would make another dolly, better and more natural than the first. He brought more clay from the brook, and remembering that Bessie called the dolly her baby, he resolved to form this one into a baby's image. That was no difficult task to the clever workman, and soon the baby dolly was lying on the board and placed in the sun to dry. Then with the clay that was left he began making an image of Bessie Blithesome herself. This was not so easy, for he found he could not make the silken robe of the Lord's daughter out of common clay. So he called the fairies to his aid and asked them to bring him colored silks with which to make a real dress for the clay image. The fairies set off at once on their errand, and before nightfall they returned with a generous supply of silks and laces and golden thread. Claus now became impatient to complete his new dolly, and instead of waiting for the next day's sun, he placed the clay image upon his hearth and covered it over with glowing coals. By morning, when he drew the dolly from the ashes, it had baked as hard as if it had lain a full day in the hot sun. Now our Claus became a dressmaker as well as a toy maker. He cut the lavender silk and neatly sewed it into a beautiful gown that just fitted the new dolly, and he put the lace collar around its neck and pink shoes on its feet. The natural color of the baked clay is a light gray, but Claus painted the face to resemble the color of flesh, and he gave the dolly Bessie's brown eyes and golden hair and rosy cheeks. It was really a beautiful thing to look upon, and sure to bring joy to some childish heart. When Claus was admiring it, he heard a knock on his door, and little Mayrie entered. Her face was set and her eyes red with continued weeping. "What has grieved you, my dear?" asked Claus, taking the child in his arms. I've woke my cat," sobbed Mayrie. "How?" he inquired, his eyes twinkling. "I dropped him and broke off his tail, and then I dropped him and broke off his ear, and now he's all spoilt." Claus laughed. "Never mind, Mayrie, dear. How would you like this new dolly instead of a cat?" Mayrie looked at the silk-robed dolly, and her eyes grew big with astonishment. "Oh, Claus!" she cried, clapping her small hands together with rapture. "Can I have it a beautiful lady?" "Do you like it?" he asked. "I love it," she said. "It's better in tats." "Then take it, dear, and be careful not to break it." Mayrie took the dolly with a joy that was almost reverent, and her face dimpled with smiles as she started along the path toward home.